Good afternoon. I welcome you to the Église Sainte-Thérèse in Hirson. Today I'm going to make a video which is perhaps rather different from the ones I have made in the past. Not long ago, I had a most fascinating conversation with a music lover who was telling me that it was very difficult to find easily understandable information, or one could call it analysis, about pieces that he wanted to know more about, or even about how music was made. Well, not how music was made, but what music is. I suppose music is one of these slightly strange things that one sees very differently depending on one's past experience, on one's knowledge, and also on what one wants to see. I know for a fact that I hear pieces very differently after I have been exposed to their scores. I suppose the same might be true to a certain extent of texts, where certain speeches may seem much more or indeed much less eloquent on the page than when read out in live voice. Nevertheless, I think the difference is even greater in music, and as a result of this conversation, I started thinking what it must be like for someone who has never read music. And of course, there are many such people who have the most interesting and valuable things to say about music, and not only about how they themselves perceive it, but also about its connection to important topics. Now, I find it, of course, very difficult, even impossible, to imagine hearing music without ever having read it. But I can also understand that music is one of these things where there are many things that one does not hear and which one immediately notices when reading. A great deal of musical so-called analysis is dedicated to such things. So what I thought I would try doing today is to go through with you a piece which seems to me to satisfy this rather peculiar attribute of being much easier to understand on the page than in sound, and try to communicate to you, or to somehow to make it clear to you what it is that I see in it at a first glance. Now, I'm aware that this is a very dangerous thing to do, because when I explain what is going on in the piece, what I'm actually thinking of are things that are incredibly obvious on the page. Most of musical analysis is incredibly obvious. Nevertheless, people sometimes get the wrong idea that these obvious things which jump out at one when one is reading are somehow the core and the important, the most important element of the music, that these things are what the music is about. That is, of course, not true. What I'm doing, to take the analogy of the text, is trying to make clear how each sentence grammatically fits together. This is usually quite obvious to people reading texts, and this is not some kind of arrogant statement or some pretension of intellectuality. It is not evident to people listening to music. And I say this with a certain amount of difficulty because there is also music where knowing somehow gets in the way of enjoying. So I've tried to choose a piece where that is not the case. This is the G. Dorian Fantasy by Sweelinck. Now, one thing to realize about this piece is that it is one of overwhelming emotional impact. Let's set that aside. And I just want to I just want to share with you what it's like to read the score of this piece and to see, how the grammar of it works, or how certain words are to be followed throughout the course of the development of this piece and are combined in very interesting, clever, skillful, but ultimately musical ways which are in the end subordinate to the effect of the piece, which I think it is quite fair and quite necessary to say is not only a function of these things that make up its analysis. Well, let me start. What I'm about to do comes across to me as rather dry, but of course, I think in explaining as clearly as I can the craft of some elements of this piece, I can perhaps give a measure of the admiration that I feel for the masters of this craft, even if that, of course, as I said, is not the only, and it's not even the main factor of what one is aiming for in an interpretation of the piece. The main theme of the fantasy has many parts. Indeed, that is one of the reasons that I think this piece is a particularly good choice for such a treatment, because the theme itself is so long and complex that it's quite difficult to keep all of it in one's mind automatically without having to think of it. So as you see, it has a few different segments which will then be separated and combined in interesting ways. So he starts, I'm going back into music analysis mode where I say he. Most people talking about music theory mean the composer, and I'll use that as well. So this is the theme. It's immediately combined at the beginning of the piece with its inversion. So we have the right hand playing the theme and the left hand playing also the theme, but with all the intervals that were going up switched to going down. Now, as a master of counterpoint, the first thing one does is to think what one can put above it and below it. So what Sweelinck does in the next segment is that he takes these two voices, puts them at the bottom. It's worth mentioning that this whole fantasy can be thought of as a four-voiced piece. So it's basically that there's a musical discourse which always has 4 lines, and each line is always doing something interesting. So he repeats these 2 lines and puts them into the bottom 2 spaces, so to say, and writes a free counterpoint in the 2 spaces above it. Now, this fantasy starts with, let's say, 4 similar sounding statements. By statement, that's a terrible word. Let's call them periods. For these 4 periods, there's some kind of contrapuntal artifice that's going on. So in the period I just played, it was that you introduced the first 2 lines, which have this substructure of being mirror images of each other. Then you repeat them in the bottom 2 voices, and something else happens there. Now we move on to the next period. We modify the theme slightly. In fact, in each successive period, there happen to be more and more modifications to the theme. One of the main modifications is to change the intervals. Now, these intervals are changed in a very clever and, for modern ears, not very obvious way. But I think for ancient ears, it could have been quite obvious. You see, there's a system called the hexachord system, whose details I do not know well enough to explain to you in any completeness. But essentially, it made it such that each note was sung to a syllable. Some schools of musical training nowadays still do this by making every C sung to the syllable do, every D to the syllable re, and so on. Back then it was a bit different. You basically sung a fa to every note which was one above a half step, and a mi to every note that was below the half step. So if you had the typical scale, the important thing would be that you put mi there and fa there. Now, it also meant that that note would be also a fa, because it was right on top of the half step. Now, if you then take, let's say, the theme of this fantasy, there's one part of it that goes. Now, this starts on a fa, and the fourth note of it is also a fa. Now, what Sweelinck did in some instances of this theme when it comes back in this fantasy is that he switched the 2 fas, because the sequence of syllables in the theme after the modification would be exactly the same. So instead of having you would get so let me just continue in a workmanlike way through the next part of this fantasy. So what we saw here was, you probably recognized, the theme was still at the top, the inversion of it was still at the bottom, with some intervals being switched according to the hexachord system. But one thing that is quite interesting is that in the beginning, if you remember, the right hand started first and then the left hand. So it means that you had the theme like this and its inversion in the next voice a bit further along this way. Now, what happens in the second period is that it's switched. So the left hand with the inversion of the theme starts first. And so on. So, of course, that means that the right hand also ends later than the left hand. Remember the tail end of this theme, it goes, or in the inversion. So now in the second period, the inversion at the bottom was first, and let's call it the original theme was then a bit later than that. So let me play the tail end of this and continue. Did you notice what the lowest voice was doing, voice number 4? Well, it was actually playing the latter part of the theme in inversion. And the voices above it, they were fragmenting this tail end that I just played to you. So the tail end goes. Now we take the first 3 notes of this, 4, let's say, and we start to play around with it. So we can change the intervals, we can make it slightly heightened in expression, we can make it in a different rhythm, and we can also lengthen it and make it into syncopations. Now let's put all this together. So we have the lowest voice playing this, let's say, more or less original version of the theme, and then we have all the other voices on top doing this kind of interplay, all based upon being creative with these fragments from the tail end. So now we get to the third period. So here he continues doing what he was doing, but he makes it in an even bigger scale. What I mean by that, what he was doing, was that in the musical parlance it's called a false entry. You see, we have 2 anchoring voices, in this case the bottom and the top. I think you will have recognized exactly what they were playing, meaning, once again, the original theme and the original theme in inversion staggered. The other voices are pretending to play more entries of the theme, but not actually carrying through with them. So we get this sort of popping in and out of imitations. It's like, for example, the second bit of the theme goes. Now that's in the top voice, and halfway through this, the second voice decides to almost imitate it in a different rhythm. And we have also, for example, the tail end of this motive, it goes. We know that, but before that, the second voice also puts in a word, and it does just enough to make the shape of what it's doing similar to what's about to come in the main voice. So we get. Now, what of course this whole analysis in quotation marks is missing out is what effect this has on musical meaning. But if I wanted to get into that, I would be interpreting, and that's what I set out today to not do. I just want to be, let's say, a neutral observer trying to pass on the joy of reading a score. So now I go to the fourth and last period of this first section. So now you hear that the main voice, meaning the voice that's taking all of the theme, is the lowest voice, and the other voices are all engaged in false entries, also imitating each other among themselves. For example, the top voice has a little snippet of the theme in inversion, and immediately the second voice replies with. Another interesting thing happens towards the end of this fourth period. You might have noticed that we get some very fast notes. It's in the second voice from the top. Now, what does this have to do with anything that comes before? Well, the answer is very simple. You might have already noticed. If you take all the notes in this run that are on the beat, you get. And that is the inversion of the tail end of the motive. And this procedure, which one could call division, meaning you take the theme that you have and you add notes in between, which fall then, of course, not on the beat, but between the beats, and thus making a whole smooth run of fast notes, is then used quite a lot in the later stages of the piece. Now, after these four periods, we get something quite different. One voice now slows itself down drastically, and it pokes out, note by note, the themes, the theme's tones. And the other voice improvises a sort of, well, you tell me what it is like. this procedure then gets repeated with the addition of yet another voice. And now we're going to have the lowest voice poking out these notes, and the top voice is going to do the inversion of what the left hand, this fast thing, was just doing before, and the middle voice is going to be, let's say, bouncing off this interplay of two voices, meaning it's sometimes closer to the voice on the top with all the florid things, and it's sometimes closer to the voice on the bottom, and it's sometimes imitating one, preceding the other, and so on. Didn't play that very well. Anyway, so now we get what we call an episode, meaning a piece of music which doesn't have anything to do with the theme, or doesn't include the theme in any direct way. Now, I have to admit that when analyzing a piece, it's very easy to overlook episodes, and, well, just because they are difficult to explain, but actually that's where a great amount of musical or compositional mastery is to be found. It's not terribly difficult when you're trying to write something to write exactly what you've already written. In some sense, using the theme over and over again in various guises and in various positions, in various ways of contrapuntal artifice is, well, one thing. But to write something that's entirely new but has a deeper logical connection, logical is the wrong word, a deeper musical, which also includes the emotional and the psychological connection to the rest of the piece, that is difficult, and it's often memorable. I think the following episode is certainly belonging to that category, and indeed what's very interesting about this construction, which is a bit atypical, is that he then takes the episode and integrates it into the free counterpoint around the next statement of the theme. So you hear that in the tenor voice, that means the voice number 3, we get the theme, which is sort of rising from nothing, also in very long note values, meaning it's poked out note by note, and the other voices continue to throw around that figure. Now, this is actually a very traditional way of writing music. It comes from the cantus firmus. You have a plain chant, meaning a series of notes in terms of what a composer is to do with it in this particular method, and this cannot be changed, and you put music around this series of notes which are held, and at some point people realized that it was very interesting to make this music that was around this plain chant self-referential. So you would have, let's say, one voice, so this would be the plain chant, and you had one voice suggesting a theme, and another voice would butt in and play the theme again, and then this voice would maybe play the theme but change it in a certain way, and then that one would respond again to this change, and sometimes without the plain chant noticing anything, all these voices would, let's say, agree with each other to do certain things. Now that's exactly what happens right now. So we've had this. So let's say that all the three voices, there are four voices and one of them is occupied by the plain chant. So there are three voices which are free and doing this music around. They all agree to drastically simplify this figure and to make it. So now the three voices engage in creating music out of that, but still, of course, fitting to the original theme, which is now in the garb of plain chant. We now repeat more or less this procedure, but instead of the plain chant being driven out by the tenor, we have it put in the alto. Alto means the second voice from the top. So I think you can hear what I was describing. We have one voice which is just stubbornly continuing with its plain chant, and the other voices are very flexibly relating to each other and sort of taking each other's suggestions and basically making a free fantasy and giving the music a lot of character. So that's the second section. The first section was these four periods. We now go into, I suppose, what you could call a kind of homage to the Mensuration Canon. Mensuration Canon or prolation canon is a term that basically implies, for our purposes, that you have a bunch of voices playing exactly the same thing, but at different times and at different speeds. And as you probably guess, the thing that they're playing is the original theme, more specifically the first few notes of it, which are quite recognizable. So we have basically one voice at the bottom playing it very slowly, and we have then two voices which are throwing this back and forth between themselves at a higher speed. A certain moment in that we actually had four different speeds going on at the same time. Now we have a sort of mirror image of that. We take what was at the bottom, meaning the slowest version, we put that at the top, and then we have this conversation between two, later three voices in a slightly higher speed into the bottom three voices. And what happens now is that instead of all the voices playing the same thing, some are playing the same thing in inversion. So instead of we have is what one could call a free elaboration of this of the same concept. So we have the same material in many different rhythms. Now, in a strict mensuration canon, all the four voices will actually be reading from the exact same piece of paper. And that means that, of course, the rhythm is governed by very inflexible laws. Now, what happens now is, as I said, much freer. And what that means is that a certain note may be elongated, and in another voice it's not. But the overall effect of this is that we're taking the same piece of paper and pasting it throughout all the different voices and deforming it as we go along. I deformed it a bit too much. See, for the whole bit of the third section, which we have covered until now, there has actually only been the first third of the original theme that we've been looking at. And now suddenly all the voices clear out and we start looking at all the other parts of the theme. And we have a very complex free fantasy with little snippets and fragments of all the other parts of the theme. See that it more or less follows the course of the original theme. We start with this snippet, which is treated in inversion, and then along comes, and then at the very end. Now, if you actually put these three together, you get the original theme. So we've gone through this whole fantasy, which, well, I guess I could try to explain exactly which fragment goes where and how, but to be honest, it would actually be easier to learn to read music and just to see that on the score, and it's much more beautiful. So at the end of this, let's just call it a black box for now. We arrive at this tail end of the theme, and this then gets passed between the voices in a rather forceful manner. No, I should not say that, because that's interpretation, and I'm not doing that today. At this cadence, and now we can go to what I see as the last section of the piece, the coda. And well, I'll play it to you once, and I hope that there will already be many elements and tricks, so to say, which you recognize instantly.